right, so welcome to Behind the Turf. This is our first episode. My name is Phil Jackson, and I'm the managing partner at Nature's Turf, which basically means for a small business that I do whatever needs to be done to keep the ship afloat and the customers happy.
Managing partner is a new term that I have not heard yet, and I'm impressed right off the bat.
Doesn't Adam have like lead carpenter or something in Gusto? Didn't he pick that?
Yeah, he had that for a while, yeah.
I think it still says that.
This is our 2024 new titles, but you can call me whatever you
Nice.
Okay.
I like
All
that.
right. So anyway, so for episode 1, which is our first episode of our new podcast, Behind the Turf, we are going to talk about the state of the Poa Address. But first, I want to introduce who's at the table with me, which is Ruth Wilkerson, who is on our support team.
Yeah. I was kind of hoping you'd come up with another title, the managing partner
title.
thing. Yeah, I was like, support team just sounds so...
Vibe creator.
Come on, Jerry. Come on,
I'm
Jerry.
actually
Come on
the
with something
vibe
good.
creator.
She's the minister of culture.
Yes.
But besides that, I think, Ruth, you bring a lot to the table because you talk to the customers every day. I mean, you really know the kind of concerns or questions or what they don't understand.
Yeah.
So, part of this podcast is we want to help. It's easy to be in our world that we're in and think people just understand. So we want to make sure that we're answering those questions so that our clients have the best experience possible.
Yeah, I think the client hearing it from our perspective just helps for a well-rounded experience overall and gives them a better understanding of what's going on in their lawn. It's about them, so.
And joining me to the left here is Jared Koenig, who's our expert agronomist, who's going to join us and make sure that me and Ruth don't say anything too out of scope.
Well, they rein me in and make sure that I stop talking sometimes.
Yes, he's the missionary, the turf missionary. Make sure his sermons don't run over time.
All right, so introductions are done. So now let's talk about the state of the Poa Address. This is something I think we could do every year. First, I would really, for those people who might be listening that have no idea what I just said or what I'm talking about, Jared, why don't you start off by talking about what is Poa Annua and why we're here talking about it?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. So Poa Annua, Poa Annua, there's a bunch of sort of colloquial names for it, but it's an annual grassy weed. It's probably the most frustrating one that we deal with in Atlanta lawns during the wintertime. It's certainly interesting. It's a very mobile target. So yeah, this is probably something we're going to talk about an awful lot over time for sure.
All right, Ruth, when you first heard the word Poa, what were you thinking?
I was thinking, wow, we're really starting right out the gate with the worst thing that could possibly happen to somebody's lawn.
It's
Besides Dallas grass.
It's a 3-letter word that holds the weight of a 4-letter word in our office, I think, for sure.
For sure.
Well, the reality is that, Ruth, it causes a lot of headache for a lot of our clients, right?
Yeah, it's because once it shows up in your lawn and those seed heads, it's just trying to understand that concept and relay it to a client is very challenging because they're looking at their lawn and hoping that it's going to be weed free. And all of a sudden it's being taken over by this little guy. So it's very challenging.
I mean, how would you describe it? It's just kind of little. It's almost in some. If there's enough of it, it almost doesn't look that bad. It almost looks like some type of little
plush,
fescue or right?
ground cover. Yeah.
But when it's sporadic through like a Bermuda or Georgia, it definitely is very noticeable.
That's a great point because it's like an appley green color, a yellowy green color, and so for sometimes I think in like fescue lawns and stuff that stay green through the winter time, it's not quite as striking as it is in a dormant Bermuda or zoysia lawn. But yeah, appley green colored. As far as sort of the physical nature of it, it has boat-tipped leaves, which is an interesting sort of dynamic. But then beyond that, the other really telltale sign of it is when it gets mature, it makes those white seeds, those seed heads that Ruth mentioned there. And that's, I mean, as far as identifying features of a weed go, that's kind of its hallmark for sure.
Yeah.
And I remember, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it was like 12, 15 years ago when this was a real big problem and we didn't really have a great solution.
Yeah.
But for the last decade, we've had a relatively good solution, and that's kind of not working as well.
Well, did you plan that segue? Because that's fantastic. My God, that's good. Okay. What I mean by that is 12 to 15 years ago,
A long, long time ago.
The biggest
The reason
frustration.
why I brought it up is because I remember, like, when I was doing your job, Ruth, and it was just me sitting in the office. I remember like feeling almost helpless. Like, I wanted to help these clients. They were so frustrated. They'd have sometimes newer lawns. They were so proud of them, and then all of a sudden, it's February and their lawn's dormant, and then they have it just invaded with this weed. And the products we had at the time just weren't working as well to control it. So we didn't really have a great solution.
Yeah.
Well, that solution was Spectacle.
Right.
That's the name of the active ingredient is indaziflam for all the people that are really nerdy out there.
Oh, wow. That Dazaflam.
I hope that right there is where we cue to Ruth's inaugural eye roll. That's when Ruth's very first eye roll hits the
And
video
as everybody knows,
log.
Dazaflam.
Yeah. So, but 100%. So 12 years ago, I think, is when Spectacle hit the market for the first time. And before that, traditional weed control products, especially pre-emergence and stuff, had kind of lost that love and feel. And the reason that Poa is a moving target all the while is because it has this resistance capacity. It has this capacity to develop resistance to weed control products. That happened, certainly that happened 12 to 15 years ago with prodiamine, dithiopyr, things like that. And then now, honestly, it's what is begun happening with indaziflam with Spectacle. So we're starting to see that process again, and that's why the pressure and sort of the frustration has begun to increase again with Poa Annua.
Okay, so Ruth, how are you talking to clients about it?
So might be jumping ahead of the gun here, but I currently, because we've added a third pre-emergent round for the first time this year, I'm encouraging them as far as that goes. And once they start to see it, I just try to assure them that it can be tricky to treat, but we should be able to get control of it with multiple post-emergent rounds. And that we're putting out all our pre-emergents are different to help increase the ability to target that weed. So I feel like for the most part, clients have a pretty positive experience with how we've handled it. But it's definitely a challenge for some who have just an intense amount. If they had it the year prior and they see it again, and that's when we have to talk about seed banks and the fact that, you might struggle with it for a few years before we can get really complete control of it. So.
And for some guys, that's just never. It just might be an ongoing issue.
Yeah. I do try to prepare them to manage their expectations that it will come up again, and we're just going to keep. That's what we're here for, and it's nature. We can't expect perfection out of something that we have no control over, but we can do our best on our end to.
Yeah, and that's something we talked a lot about just with all weeds in general. Yeah. Just the idea that there's zero weeds in a lawn, it's not practical, and it's really not a great thing, period.
That was the thing when we did that class, the pest license class, that was a huge thing they said is having zero tolerance for weeds or pests is unreasonable and ends up being the worst for the environment if you're caring about that. Just putting out so much product where you have nothing is not the best route. You have to have some tolerance for.
It's the idea of a threshold, right?
Yeah.
Now keep in mind that through all of this, our goal is to give the absolute best results possible, right? Yeah. So at the end of the day, we do take a lot of time and consideration and effort to make sure that we're using the right products and the right combinations. Ruth mentioned that we're doing alternations. That's responsible. So we try to be the best stewards we can of our available products. That goes for post-emergence too. Poa can be a little tricky because we treat it in the wintertime with post-emergence, so everything's a little slower. In that regard, but 100%. For the longest time, and we touched on this actually in one of our reels. Which, if you don't follow us on Instagram, do that.
Good point.
Good. Yeah, follow us on Instagram, Nature's Turf.
But we definitely touched on that at one point too. That at the end of the day, we're talking about the environment, which is just innumerable variables, right? And we're talking about biological organisms, which are constantly changing and adapting, and so our goal is to try to nominalize those variables as much as possible, and but also we aim to be really good communicators. We also aim to be very, very honest all of the time, and so we're not going to tell you something that we don't believe to be true. We're going to have honest conversations about it and win your trust in that way. That's part of the goal with Poa Annua, is to be very forthright and forthcoming about that information.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think to kind of wrap up this conversation, I thought we kind of talked about this in our team meeting this week, which is what are things that the customer or the client can do on their end to help minimize Poa in their yards. I think some of the things we talked about, which is, having beds around your house that are full of weeds, Poa in many instances, and then that weed, you're just allowing this environment where you're trying to keep it out of the grass, but you've got weeds going right up to the grass. So keeping those beds sprayed. Did we mention creek beds? You mentioned several other good examples.
Yeah. So to timestamp this a little bit, I guess we're recording this at the very beginning of December, and this year, December of 2023, we're starting to see Poa start to germinate and mature in areas that aren't treated right now. Our pre-emergents have done a really good job to lay that barrier up to those lines, but areas where pressure is high, one of our technicians, shout out to Roderick if he ever hears this, sent me a picture last week where there is some developing in a rock bed, a creek bed there, right on the edge of a property, I should say, where water runs, and then create some additional challenges too. But certainly keeping weeds out of those areas, turf adjacent areas, all that. The goal there is really to keep the seeds from ending up in the turf areas that they're adjacent to. And edges tend to be the hardest places to keep weeds out of anyways, sort of right at those margins. So a little bit of team effort, a little integrated pest management there, if you will, certainly helps.
And if you pull the weed out of your bed, don't toss it into the grass. I beg you.
Preach.
Dear listener, please.
All right, that's the end of our first episode, unless you guys have something extra to add about Poa.
No, I just love talking about Poa. I could talk about it all day, all night, but I think it's...
But some of our listeners might not want to.
But some of our listeners just don't want to hear it.
But the reality is like you said, Jared, I think, our team's here to help our clients through that. Hopefully that's why we're doing these kind of things like this podcast to kind of better inform, so people understand when they see it that we're not purposely letting them down,
Yeah.
And again, having that honest conversation of like what we have in our toolbox that can help them and what we can't do, I think just helps the relationship.
Yeah. And to know that we're constantly trying to find the best solutions, I think that's important to know. We, like you said, we're actually actively trying to improve it, which is why we changed that round 9 this year to a third pre-emergent.
We are dynamic. That is true.
Yes. Oh, wow. So dynamic.
All right. Well, if you've enjoyed that episode of Behind the Turf, we hope you'll join us for episode number 2.